Hello and welcome to the Grace Pathway class, the Old Testament and the Surrounding World. My name is David Wollaston, and originally this course was a series of 4 lectures, and it will be broken up into a smaller series of lectures, but the purpose of this class is to take the Old Testament Bible stories that we all grew up with and try to ground them in time, in the timeline of human history. We're going to learn about some of the other civilizations that were around during the Old Testament time. We're going to learn different peoples, their accomplishments, their histories. We're going to talk a little bit here about the terms prehistory versus history. Prehistory is simply anything before the advent of writing. And so all of what I'm going to be talking about is in the historical time period where I can actually show you some facts about some of these different peoples. One of the questions that I got asked early on was how do things get dated in the archaeological record? And one of the main forms of dating was carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 is a great tool, but it also has some flaws. To simply explain how carbon-14 occurs, and you can get a number from it. In our atmosphere, there's the element nitrogen, particularly nitrogen-14. In the upper atmosphere, that gets hit with cosmic rays, and when the ions get bumped all around, it changes the nitrogen-14 into a radioactive element called carbon-14. That ends up settling down into the planet where it gets basically breathed in by all living things, plant or animal. And then when we die, we stop breathing it in. And that's when the amount of carbon-14 in the organism would start decaying. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years, which is a rock solid number, and which that means that every 5,730 years you lose half of that radioactive isotope in the organism that you're looking at. Some of the flaws would be that carbon-14 dating can only go back roughly 50,000 years. So anything older than that, it wouldn't have any carbon-14 left in it. The other flaw could be there are differences in the amount of nitrogen-14 in the upper atmosphere. There's differences in the cosmic rays that go through the upper atmosphere. And so depending on even climate change, the use of fossil fuels, since carbon-14 dating was discovered around 1940, there have been changes in the amount present in our atmosphere alone, and there's no way of knowing how the changes would have occurred going back through time. So what we're going to do is we're going to start looking through the Old Testament where we can start putting together a historical record. And I'm going to start with why we're not going to start with the Tower of Babel. So let's look at that. The Tower of Babel. The Bible tells us that historically in Genesis 11 verses 3 through 8, I'm just going to read it here. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the earth." But the Lord came down to the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them all over the face of the earth. They stopped building that city. That is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth. So, the answer to the question why we're not going to start with the Tower of Babel is that we have a city that has been lost to time. It was on the plains of Shinar, and Shinar is a term the Hebrews used that we believe is for the general region of Mesopotamia. The buildings were partially baked mud bricks, and all of the stories and images that we grew up seeing, the Tower of Babel was pictured as something similar to the Empire State Building reaching all the way up to the sky. The Bible does not say that. It just says that it was partially built of mud bricks. Stone in Mesopotamia is not a common building material. It's basically a floodplain. So they did use mud baked bricks, which we'll see in a little bit here when I start talking about the Sumerian people. We do have some dates and times that are pretty accurate for other large building projects in the ancient world. The Great Pyramids of Giza, for example, were built roughly between 2600 and 2500 BC. The monument at Stonehenge, 3100 to 2500 BC. And something to mention about the dates, the range of dates might seem rather large to you, but that far back in time, the numbers can't be accurately pinned down very much closer than that. A lot of people will say they can date things to an exact year, but I don't think that's reasonable. So we're going to not start with the Tower of Babel because we haven't found any sign of it yet. But just because we haven't found it yet, that doesn't mean much. The Hittite civilization was mentioned in the Bible frequently and was considered a myth until the 1880s when it was discovered. And I'll have a whole class on the Hittites coming up. So after the Tower of Babel, we come to Abraham. So we're going to start where we have more information. From Genesis, we know that Abraham was from Ur the Chaldeans or Ur the Chaldees. That's important to us because Chaldees refers to a group of people living in southern Sumer. Ur of the Chaldees was a coastal Sumerian city-state during an intermediate period in Sumerian history. An intermediate period is a time between dynasties. And if you look on the map, you will note down in the corner, you can see where the ancient coastline was. Biblical scholars have placed the high date for the birth of Abram to 2166 BC to a low date of 1952 BC. We know that he went from Ur of the Chaldees to Haran, then on into Canaan, and then into Egypt. So let's go ahead and look at some of the people that he would have been from during this time. The Sumerian civilization is the oldest civilization known on the planet. Roughly 3000 BC, lasting until roughly 1790 BC. It was in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and the Sumerians were the name given the groups of peoples. There were many different people groups in that area that came together, and they lived in a bunch of different city-states that ended up becoming united under the first dynasty, which is the Sumerian dynasty, which is where the name for the whole civilization comes from. City-states, if you think similar to Athens or Sparta in ancient Greece, where it's one city, they control the land around them, and they're an independent kingdom. So basically all of the city-states got together under the Sumerian dynasty, the first Sumerian dynasty of kings. That dynasty went from 3000 BC to roughly 2300 BC. The second dynasty is called the Akkadian dynasty, and it was ruled by Sargon the Great, was probably the most famous king from that line. Then the third dynasty was ruled by Ur of the Chaldeans. And that would have been sometime around 2100 BC to around 1950 BC, when it was destroyed by the Amorites and then later again destroyed by the Elamites. The city-state of Ur was the capital of Sumer on more than one occasion, but it's only referred to of the Chaldees during the intermediate period of the third dynasty. The intermediate periods simply mean it's a period where there is no centralized authority between the different city-states. Here on a map coming up, I'm going to show you where Sumer is was located, with modern locations also showing. So one of the most magnificent features of Ur is the Great Ziggurat. This structure would predate the time of Abraham, and I'll show you some photos of it and the ruins of Ur. The Great Ziggurat was built around 2100 BC. It's a massive structure, 210 feet wide by 150 feet long and 100 feet high. It is a step pyramid, similar to the Mayan and Aztec pyramids, but built thousands of years before either of those cultures. It's composed of terrace running around its ledges, and Sumerian texts show King Ur-Nammu started the construction of it. It is composed of sun-baked bricks, and the burnt bricks are set with bitumen, which is a tar-like substance similar to asphalt. The temple complex was dedicated to the moon god Nana, who was the patron deity of Ur. This is showing U.S. Marines climbing up the ziggurat of Ur, which is now on the edge of the Ali Air Base in Iraq. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein ordered the partial reconstruction of the facade of the pyramid and the reconstruction of the monumental staircase. In 1991, during the Gulf War, Saddam parked some of his MiG jets next to the ziggurat, hoping to save it from the U.S. Air Force. Today, there's over 400 bullet holes from the strafing that can still be seen in the side of the ziggurat. In the 4th century BC, the Euphrates River changed its course and covered the remains of the city of Ur, but it was rediscovered in 1922 by Sir Leonard Woolsey, a British archaeologist. One of the many technological advances attributed to the Sumerians, I'm going to go ahead and mention a few of them. Agriculture is believed to have been started by the Sumerian civilization. They have been able to document and show where the Sumerians used irrigation to water their crops. Trade networks are another important technological improvement. This part of the Fertile Crescent is rather poor in minerals and stone, and that's why all the building materials were sun-baked bricks. Grave goods found show many gemstones, gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, which has been found in the Royal Cemetery. Lapis lazuli is a gemstone found in regions around Afghanistan. Tin also comes from this region. And according to different cuneiform tablets, most of the trade goods coming out of Sumeria were crops and animals being traded for metals and gemstones. Another technological advance coming from the Sumerian people is the base 60 numerical system, and where we're used to today the base 10 counting system. The base 60 system originated with the ancient Sumerians in the 3rd millennium BC, and it was passed down to the ancient Babylonians and is still in use in a modified form for measuring time, angles, and geographic coordinates. This time period in history that I'm talking about is called the Bronze Age, which roughly occurs, depending on your location in the world, from 3000 BC to around 1200 BC. Geographics made a huge difference in it. For example, in ancient Britain, the end of the Stone Age and the start of the Bronze Age occurred around 2000 BC, and the Iron Age didn't come in until around 650 BC. As written in 1 Kings in the Old Testament, the David versus Goliath battle, the Philistines had iron weapons, as mentioned, and the Hebrews had very few iron weapons. I believe it specifically says that they had 3 for their whole army. Date ranges for that battle, the high date would be around 1090 BC, and the low date would be around 1020 BC, but we'll talk about that a little later in a different course. One thing to mention is how the Bible has been used as history. It's one of the most important books archaeologists have used for discovering ancient civilizations. It's still used today. Speaking of bronze is made from a mixture of copper and tin, and metals were melted and poured, cast into weapons, armor, and other items. The last technological advancement that I'm going to talk about today is cuneiform writing. Cuneiform writing system, it's not an alphabet. It doesn't have letters. Instead, it used between 600 and 1,000 characters to write words or parts of words, or symbols. There's 2 main languages in the cuneiform writing system. The first and oldest is Sumerian, and the second and most lasting is Akkadian. There are many surviving examples of cuneiform writing, which I'm going to show you 2 examples of. As I mentioned earlier, one of the kings of Sumer, the main, most important king of the 2nd dynasty, was Sargon the Great. He was one of the Akkad people. He rose to power around 2300 BC, so approximately 200 to 400 years before Abram, and he took over the city-states of Sumer. This image is the image of Enheduanna, and she is the daughter of Sargon the Great. She's important to know because she is the world's first known author by name. When Sargon the Great took over Sumer, he made his daughter High Priestess of Ur, and she wrote a poem called The Exaltation of Inanna, which tells the story of being driven from her post as High Priestess and cast into exile. Then it has a plea to Inanna, and she ends up being restored to power. The image that you see of Enheduanna was discovered by Sir Wolsey in 1927, and like I said, the oldest known author in human history lived over 4,000 ago, and her name was Enheduanna. I think it's really cool, and I just like saying her name. Our second example of cuneiform writing that I'm going to share is from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It tells us of early Mesopotamian belief systems, classes, the class structure of its people, and it also has the story of Gilgamesh and the change of his character through his adventures. More importantly, one of the tablets that tells the story has the Sumerian version of the flood story, which is amazingly similar to the later Hebrew account. And I'm going to go ahead and read you the Sumerian flood account. So on tablet 11, it starts, "In the time before the flood, there was a city, Shuparik, on the banks of the Euphrates. There, the council of gods held a secret meeting. They all resolved to destroy the world in a great flood. All of the gods were under an oath not to reveal this secret to any living thing. But Ea, one of the gods that created humanity, came to Upnashtim's house and told the secret to the walls of his house. thus technically not violating his oath to the rest of the gods. He advised the walls of the house to build a great boat, its length as great as its breadth, to cover the boat and to bring all living things into the boat. Upnashtim gets straight to work, finishes the great boat by the new year. Then he loads the boat with gold, silver, and all living things of the earth and launches the boat. Ea orders him into the boat and commands him to close the door behind him. The black clouds arrive with the thunder god Adad rumbling with them. The earth splits like an earthen pot, and all lights turn to darkness. The flood is so great that even the gods are frightened. The gods shook like beaten dogs, hidden in the far corners of heaven. Ishtar screamed and wailed, "The days of old have turned to stone. We have decided evil things in our assembly." Why did we decide these evil things in our assembly? Why did we decide to destroy our people? We have only just now created our beloved humans. Now we destroy them in the sea. All the gods wept and wailed along with her. All the gods sat trembling and wept. The flood lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. Finally, light returned to the earth. Upnashtim opens the window, and the entire earth had been turned to a flat ocean. All humans have been turned to stone. Then he falls to his knees and weeps. His boat comes to rest at the top of Mount Numish. The boat lodges there firmly on the peak just below the surface of the ocean and remains there for 7 days. On the 7th day, Upnashtim released a dove from the boat. It flew off, but circled and returned, for it could find no perch. Then he released a swallow from the boat. It flew off, but circled around and returned, for it could find no perch. Then he released a raven. It flew off. The waters receded. It eats, it scratches the ground, but it does not circle around and return. Then he sends out all living things in each direction and sacrificed a sheep on that very spot. Interesting as that is, lots of other religions and belief systems on the planet have flood stories of their own. And this chart will kind of give you an example of that. So, ends up being sacked by the Amorites and then the Elamites roughly around 1950 BC. Then there followed more intermediate periods with little or no centralized government. Finally, Sumer ends up breaking into 2 parts around the year 1790 BC. The northern part becomes ruled by the Assyrians, which we'll talk about in another lecture, and the southern part by the Babylonians, which will also have a lecture of their own. Both the Assyrians and the Babylonians drew heavily on their Sumerian background and culture. I'm going to close this whole lecture out by reading a poem called The Lamentation of Ur. It's on the fall of Ur, a poem written about the sacking by the Elamites. O Father Nana, that town was left a ruin. The people mourned. On that day did the storm leave the country. The people mourn. Its people, not potsherds, litter the approaches. The walls were gaping. The high gates, the roads were piled with dead. In the wide streets, where feasting crowds once gathered, jumbled they lay. In all the streets and roadways, bodies lay. In the open fields that used to be filled with dancers, people lay in heaps. The country's blood now fills its holes like metal in a mold, bodies dissolved like butter left in the sun. I hope you all enjoyed this brief introduction to the earliest civilization in human history. Following Abram through the Old Testament, next time I'll talk to you about Haran, and then I'll touch Canaan briefly, as that was Abram's next stop down his timeline through history. It's going to probably be a shorter class, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then I can show you, after that class, Well, during that class, I'll show you what the Canaanite people looked like in the days of Abram. And this information comes to us through Egyptian tomb paintings. And the Egyptians were fantastic at leaving us written records of the Canaanite people and why they left Canaan and moved on down into Egypt. So, thank you for watching my class on ancient history, and I'll catch you next time.